What if John Sykes had stayed in Whitesnake? Imagine you write the album and you play every guitar solo on it. You co-write 9 of the tracks and you build the machine from the ground up, and then someone hands you your walking papers before a single copy hits the store. That's exactly what happened to John Sykes in late 1986. And if you've seen my previous Whitesnake video, you already know the story of how that album got made and what it cost him. So today, I'm not going to go back over that ground. Today, I'm asking a different question. What if John Sykes had stayed? What would the follow-up album have sounded like, and how does rock history look different? And here's the thing, I'm not just speculating wildly, because there's actually a pretty remarkable piece of documented evidence to reason from. And it's Blue Murder's debut album. That's basically the answer. And I'm going to dig into exactly why. So let's give a brief recap. Just for a quick reset, because we need to understand what Sykes was walking away from. The 1987 Whitesnake album is one of the biggest hard rock records ever made. It peaked at number 2 on the Billboard 200 album chart, and it held that position for 10 non-consecutive weeks. And why couldn't it get to number 1? Because it got blocked by 3 different albums. One was U2's The Joshua Tree, the second one was Whitney Houston's Whitney album, and the third one was Michael Jackson's Bad. That's the company this record was keeping. I mean, it sold 8 million copies in the United States alone. And through 2025, it sold 25 million copies worldwide. Here I go again. It went to number 1 on the Hot 100 singles chart. And Is This Love went to number 2. In 1987, you were essentially competing against Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, and U2 to beat Whitesnake. And nobody could. And John Sykes, the man who co-wrote 9 of those tracks and was all over that recording, was gone before the album was even released. He was dismissed, replaced. And here's how the exit actually played out, because the details do matter. So the wages for Ainsley Dunbar and Neil Murray, who were in the band, they were cut off on April 1st, 1986, while the album was still being finished. Dunbar took that as his cue to move on, but Murray had a little bit of a different situation. He was never formally fired. He actually came back to re-record some of the bass parts, and he found out he was out of the band when he read in Kerrang! Magazine, and they had printed the new Whitesnake lineup. Nobody had called him. He read it in a magazine, and that's how Coverdale operated. John Sykes was pushed out in late 1986 as the album wrapped and before it ever made it to stores. So the touring band for that tour ended up being Adrian Vandenberg and Vivian Campbell on guitars, Rudy Sarzo on bass, and Tommy Aldridge on drums. They were assembled entirely after the album was recorded, and it took 2 guitarists to replace Sykes live. Now here's where it gets interesting. This is the Blue Murder evidence. After getting pushed out of Whitesnake, John Sykes, he didn't take a break. He assembled a new band, and he went straight back to Little Mountain Sound Studios over in Vancouver, Canada. Now, this was the same studio where he just made the Whitesnake record with the same producer, Bob Rock, and engineer, Mike Frazier. The recording for that Blue Murder album began in February of 1988, and what they made was that debut. It was the same room, the same gear, the same production team. The same amps he'd used on every Whitesnake guitar track, and here's what came out. Riot, Valley of the Kings, Ptolemy, and Black-Hearted Woman, along with Out of Love, which was a great ballad. The album is the blueprint for this whole conversation that I'm having with you today, because it tells us with documented precision exactly what John Sykes was capable of making in 1988 and 1989 in the same creative space, on the same gear, with the same iconic framework. And what he made was even heavier than the Whitesnake record. It was darker and more ambitious in its structures. Valley of the Kings, for instance, it runs almost 8 minutes. And Riot, that song is over 6 minutes long. So these aren't 3-minute hair metal pop singles. These are songs designed to be experienced. Sykes himself actually said he deliberately pushed Blue Murder heavier than the '87 Whitesnake album, a combination of Whitesnake, Thin Lizzy, and the blues. He wanted more weight, more space, more room for the guitar to breathe. The critical reception was phenomenal for this album. When it came out, Kerrang's Neil Jeffries called it a masterpiece, and Raw magazine gave it a 10 out of 10. AllMusic later wrote that it endured far better than most similarly styled heavy metal albums of that era. Commercially, though, it peaked at number 69 in the US and number 45 in the UK, and the gap between the critical acclaim and the commercial performance has a complicated explanation that we'll come back to. But here's the point, and this is the key point. Blue Murder is the most reliable evidence we have of what John Sykes was building toward at exactly the moment that Coverdale pushed him out the door of Whitesnake, which means when we ask what the Whitesnake follow-up would have sounded like, we're not guessing in the dark. We have actual proof on tape. So here's the pivot point. How does John Sykes end up staying in Whitesnake? So before we get to that alternate album that would have been released with Sykes still in Whitesnake, we have to be honest about one thing. Keeping Sykes in Whitesnake was structurally very difficult because it wasn't because of musical differences, because clearly they made extraordinary music together, but because of the power architecture underneath the band. Whitesnake, it was never a democracy. It was David Coverdale's solo vehicle with a band name on it. He owned the name, he controlled the Geffen Records deal, and his documented history across a decade of lineups and lineup changes, including Mickey Moody, Bernie Marsden, Neil Murray, Cozy Powell, and on, his MO was to replace people rather than to renegotiate with them. And that pattern didn't exist for Sykes because Sykes was different and he was more important to Coverdale. It really existed because the structure of the band, it rewarded replacement over negotiation. And it always had up to this point. So for this alternate history to hold water, we need a realistic intervention. And there's actually one that's historically plausible. His name is John Kalodner. John Kalodner was the Geffen Records A&R man who championed Whitesnake in the US. He pushed for the re-recording of Here I Go Again and Crying in the Rain, and he shaped the album's entire commercial presentation. He understood that the Coverdale-Sykes songwriting chemistry was the engine that had produced this record. And Geffen had leverage. They controlled the recording contract. The pivot point in this alternate timeline is John Kalodner, because in late 1986, going to both men and brokering a structured deal was what he ended up doing in the alternate timeline. It had nothing to do with friendship or generosity. It was pure calculation. In this part of the alternate history, Sykes gets guaranteed co-equal songwriting credit and royalty on future Whitesnake albums. His name stays in the official lineup materials, and any termination of him requires a settlement that makes dismissal genuinely expensive. Coverdale doesn't agree because he suddenly values being an equal with other band members. He really agrees because the cost of firing Sykes has been made high enough that even his ego doesn't find it worth paying that price. So is this a certainty? No, but it's grounded in how major label dynamics actually worked at that moment in the 80s. Geffen Records was about to generate an enormous amount of financial windfall on this upcoming record, and protecting the creative partnership that produced it, it was in their financial best interest. An ultimatum from the right person at the right moment could have changed that mathematics. That's the hinge on which the alternate history I'm going to dive into pivots. So let's jump into this alternate album, which we're going to call White Heat, and I'll explain why shortly. With rock at the board and Sykes guitar close-ups, we're going to build that record. Coverdale and Sykes, they go back into the Little Mountain studios with Bob Rock in 1988. The deal is structured and Sykes has his co-writer protection. Coverdale has his commercial instincts and his voice, which at this point in his career, it was arguably at its absolute peak as a rock instrument. And they sit down to make the follow-up to one of the biggest hard rock albums ever made. And here's what the record doesn't sound like. It doesn't sound like Steve Vai. Because in the actual timeline, Vai joined Whitesnake only because Adrian Vandenberg, which was Coverdale's replacement for Sykes, he injured his wrist before he could record Slip of the Tongue. And that only exists because Sykes left. So in the alternate world that we're going to discuss, Vandenberg was never recruited, there's no injury, and there's no emergency call to Steve Vai. The guitar voice on this record is John Sykes. It's his Les Paul into Mesa Boogie from start to finish, period. Now, what's on this record? So the creative tension in the room is actually a productive and a good one. Coverdale pulls, the material towards more of a commercial craft, radio structured, MTV ready hooks. And Sykes, he's pulling towards weight, ambition, and songs that breathe, heaviness. The 1987 album worked precisely because both forces were still in play. Still of the Night is a 6.5-minute Zeppelin-descended warhorse, and it's sat on the same record as Is This Love, a polished, perfectly constructed MTV ballad. That balance was the secret weapon. And in the alternate record, that tension produces something like this. Take the song Riot from the Blue Murder album that leads the album off. That's a churning mid-tempo riff, and the way it builds from the rhythm section into a full guitar assault. If you put Coverdale's voice on that, you have a lead single. The structure is tight enough at its core that radio formats it without losing what made its riff compelling, and Coverdale's voice in this period could ride that kind of groove the way Robert Plant did in the early years of Zeppelin. If you take the track Valley of the Kings, it's an ambitious 8-minute track. It's sort of like an Egyptian-flavored melodic theme. It was developed across an extended rock arrangement. It was big. It is big. And that becomes the album's signature track. The deep cut that serious fans will return to, including myself, again and again, the way Zeppelin fans return to Achilles' Last Stand or Kashmir. Radio's not big on this track, but everyone who owns the record knows it cold. The power ballad on this record, because every major hard rock album of this era required one, it lands somewhere in the territory of the song Out of Love. And that song is on the Blue Murder debut album. It's a melodically sophisticated, emotionally direct, and it is built on a guitar foundation rather than keyboard padding. Is This Love worked on the '87 album because the guitar and vocals shared a melodic vocabulary. And the alternate ballad, Out of Love, does the same thing. Bob Rock's production at this moment was evolving toward what he'd later bring to Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood and the Metallica Black album. It was warm and controlled low-end, drums recorded with real presence and punch, and guitars layered for mass without losing their articulation. This alternate record benefits from Rock at the peak of his commercial hard rock powers. And the title? Coverdale used White Heat as a working title for various projects in this era, so White Heat is what we'll call it. So how does White Heat perform? Well, here's where kind of, we have to really be honest and precise, because when you're doing an alternate history, the temptation is to make everything better than it actually was. Whitesnake's Slip of the Tongue album was the album that actually came out in November of 1989. It peaked at number 10 on the Billboard Top 200 album chart, and it sold roughly 1 million copies in the US and around 4 million worldwide. Even Coverdale, he admitted later on in years that there's something missing, something he couldn't fully articulate. It was like a certain Whitesnake feel. And Adrian Vandenberg even said himself that Vai's technically brilliant, over-the-top approach, it really wasn't right for Coverdale's material, and it needed something bluesier and maybe heavier. And he was correct. So this alternate White Heat album starts from a better foundation. You got the right guitarist for the right songs, the right production team, and a creative partnership that's still producing elite material. The commercial landscape in 1989 is brutally competitive, though. Bon Jovi's New Jersey had been out since September of '88, and that had sold about 7 million copies in the US and 5 top 10 singles. Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood, which was produced notably by the same Bob Rock and the same Little Mountain Studios, that drops September 1st. Aerosmith's Pump, that arrived on September 12th, and Skid Row's debut is already charting. This is the peak saturation for the hard rock market, and the competition, it's operating at the top of its game. But here's what actually matters. Sykes' guitar vocabulary, his Les Paul tone, his blues-rooted phrasing, his compositional weight. This aligned much more closely with where the serious end of the market was heading. For instance, Aerosmith's resurgence and Motley Crue's biggest commercial successes both proved that audiences in 1989, they'd reward a groove-driven, blues-rooted hard rock record over a technically flashy one. This alternate White Heat record, it competes credibly in that company. So realistic expectations for White Heat, we're talking somewhere in the 3 to 4 million range in sales, solid multi-platinum in the US. You have multiple top 5 rock singles at radio. It's a top 10 album. It doesn't match the cultural moment of the '87 Whitesnake album. That was sort of a perfect storm of MTV at its peak influence, and you had maximum hard rock saturation and a creative lightning in a bottle that really couldn't be exactly replicated. But it significantly outperforms Slip of the Tongue, and it does so while being received as a genuine artistic evolution. It's darker, heavier, more ambitious, rather than a band that's lost its own identity. So let's talk about the ripple effects now. So when you change something this significantly, the shockwaves reach further than you'd expect. Blue Murder in the alternate history never exists. The sound's simple, but it matters enormously because Tony Franklin's fretless bass, one of the most distinctive elements of that record, and giving it a bottom end that conventional hard rock bass simply couldn't have, and that never happens. He never gets recruited because there is no Blue Murder. Carmine Appice, who was the drummer in Blue Murder and brought one of rock's deepest pedigrees to the drum chair, he never gets that platform. And the album itself, the one that Kerrang called a masterpiece, the one that Miles Kennedy and a generation of musicians quietly obsessed over, it simply doesn't get made. One of the genuinely unheard of great hard rock records of his era never exists in history. That's a real loss. Steve Vai's trajectory changes significantly also. In the actual timeline, Vai left David Lee Roth's band after the Skyscraper tour in 1989, and he got an emergency call from Whitesnake's almost immediately. Coverdale basically told him Vanderberg can't play. He injured his wrist. And so Vai spent the time between finishing the Slip of the Tongue album and the Whitesnake tour, recording his own solo album, Passion and Warfare, simultaneously at his home studio. So the two projects basically were overlapping. Coverdale, Vandenberg, and Sarzo all contributed backing vocals to Steve Vai's Passion and Warfare also. That Whitesnake platform gave Vai constant MTV presence through 1989 and 1990. And when Passion and Warfare dropped in May of 1990, it reached number 18 on the Billboard 200 album chart. I mean, that's an extraordinary performance for an all-instrumental guitar record. But in this alternate timeline, Whitesnake doesn't call Vai. There is no call. There's no emergency. There's no Vandenberg injury in a band Vandenberg was never in. Vai leaves Roth and goes straight to Passion and Warfare, and he recorded it without the interim gig. The album may arrive earlier than it actually did, perhaps in late '89, but without the commercial setup that Whitesnake visibility provided Steve Vai, it still reaches its core guitar audience. The real question is whether it goes gold without the Whitesnake platform underneath it. Vai is eventually still Steve Vai, but the specific cultural and commercial impact of Passion and Warfare, it's going to look different. The Coverdale Page album, which came out, it almost certainly never happens, at least not in the same way. Here's what actually drove that collaboration in the real timeline. Coverdale disbanded Whitesnake in September of 1990 after Slip of the Tongue, after that tour was finished. And he took an extended break and eventually began working with Jimmy Page, with the project being brokered by John Kalodner, who saw an opportunity to pair the two Geffen recording artists who both needed a compelling next chapter in their career. In Wikipedia, they frame that this was Jimmy Page's way of trying to goad Robert Plant into a Led Zeppelin reunion. It's a compelling theory, but Jimmy Page himself has called this pathetic and absurd. And the reality seems to be that both men, Page and Coverdale, they wanted a creative collaborator, and they found that chemistry and made a record together. It reached number 4 in the UK and number 5 in the US. In this alternate timeline we're talking about, where Sykes stays in Whitesnake, if White Heat sells 3 to 4 million copies, Coverdale doesn't disband Whitesnake in 1990. He has a functioning, commercially viable partnership with Sykes that's still producing results. So there's no extended hiatus. There's no period of idleness that makes him receptive to an outside offer. The Page collaboration either doesn't happen or it happens years later in a very different set of circumstances. And that changes Coverdale's long-term position in rock history. That association with Jimmy Page, it elevated him into a different register entirely. So the long game, how long would Sykes have lasted if he would have stayed in Whitesnake? So never mind, actually, here's the honest part of the conversation. Because the temptation in alternate history is to make the good version last forever, and let's be honest, good things don't last forever. The structural power imbalance between Coverdale and Sykes, it doesn't disappear because of a better contract between the two men. It's managed and delayed, and Coverdale still owns the name. Sykes still has a creative ambition that exceeds what a supporting role in someone else's band like Whitesnake can contain. And Blue Murder proved that. The contract protects Sykes financially, but it doesn't make them equals. And the history of rock and roll is full of co-writing partnerships that held for 1 or 2 albums before the dominant partner found a way to reassert their control. And then there's the grunge wave. By 1991, Nevermind had permanently changed the commercial landscape, and the audience for polished MTV-driven hard rock contracted sharply, and it didn't come back anytime soon. Every major act in that genre was scrambling to adapt or decline or die. And Coverdale's instinct, as evidenced by what he actually did do in the 90s, was to slow things down and seek collaborations like with Jimmy Page and then wait. Now, Sykes, his instinct was just the opposite. Go heavier, go raw, lean into the blues roots, care less about commercial positioning. So those two temperaments, they produce another year or 2 of creative tension before reaching an irreconcilable point. And the most realistic alternate timeline sees them make 2 albums together. They end up making White Heat in 1989, which we've discussed, and possibly one more record in 1991, before the grunge transition terminates the commercial rationale for the partnership. And then the split comes. It probably comes around 1992. But that's 1992 instead of 1986 when it actually happened. So what the alternate history changes is not the end point. Both worlds end with Sykes and Coverdale apart. What changes is the body of work that is produced in between. What changes is one more great hard rock album, the album with the ambition of Blue Murder and the commercial craft of Whitesnake, delivered to an audience of 3 to 4 million people rather than the 500,000 who found Blue Murder on the shelf at the record store and picked it up on a hunch. In the actual world, we have Blue Murder instead. Sykes without Coverdale, raw, heavier, more uncompromising, and criminally underheard. It may honestly be the purer artifact, the version made entirely on his own terms. But the alternate history's gift would have been the commercial version of what he had inside him, delivered to an audience large enough to have actually heard it. And that audience missed it by the width of one contract negotiation. So the Sykes-Coverdale story is one of those chapters in rock history where the business reality and the music reality, they never really aligned. The guy who built the machine watched somebody else drive it. And the album he could have made and he should have made with that infrastructure and that commercial momentum, it exists only in the imagination with Blue Murder as its only surviving result. If you found this video and you've never sat down with the Blue Murder debut, do yourself a favor. Put on Valley of the Kings, turn it up, and ask yourself whether that record deserved to reach 25 million people. I think you'll know the answer once you listen to it. So subscribe if you're new here and you enjoy this kind of content, and please drop your thoughts in the comments below. I really enjoy reading them, and I get back to you. I'll answer them and interact with y'all as well. I generally want to know what you think is the alternate White Hot or White Heat track list and what that would have looked like. And I'll see you in the next one.